History is packed with power, plays, dramatic showdowns, and moments that leave you gasping bafbia, giving up crowns, titles, vast lands, and millions of subjects. For the Habsburgs, a family that ruled over massive parts of Europe for centuries, it happened more than once. These weren't quiet retirements. These were earth-shattering decisions that changed the face of nations, sometimes born from crushing defeat, sometimes from sheer exhaustion, and sometimes from an unbelievable twist of fate. Get ready to dive into 6 of the most mind-blowing times a Habsburg ruler just decided they were done. Number 6. Charles VI. The Spanish throne that got away. The air in Europe in the early 1700s crackled with tension. A grand drama unfolding across kingdoms. This was the era of the War of the Spanish Succession, a colossal struggle that pitted the mightiest powers against each other for who would sit on the throne of Spain. And at the heart of the Habsburg claim to that throne was a young, ambitious Archduke Charles, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. Born in 1685, Charles was the second son of Emperor Leopold I. He grew up in Vienna, a city of grand palaces and intricate courtly life, but also one steeped in the deep traditions of the Habsburg dynasty. The family's motto, Austriae est imperare, orbi universo, or it is Austria's destiny to rule the whole world, wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a guiding principle. From a young age, Charles was educated for greatness, his tutors filling his mind with history, languages, and the complex art of governance. He learned about the vast empire his family commanded from the Holy Roman Empire to the kingdoms of Bohemia and Hungary. Yet looming large over his early life was the looming question of Spain. The Spanish Habsburg line, once the richest and most powerful branch of the family, was on its last legs. King Charles II of Spain, often called the Bewitched, was a sickly, childless monarch. The tragic product of generations of close family marriages. As he faded, the vultures circled. Francis King, Louis XIV. The Sun King had a grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou, who was a strong contender through his mother. But the Habsburgs of Austria believed the Spanish throne was their rightful inheritance, a continuation of their family's long and glorious legacy. So when Charles II of Spain finally passed away in 1700, his will shockingly named Philip, Duke of Anjou, as his successor. This sent shockwaves across Europe. The idea of a Bourbon prince, from the powerful French royal family controlling both France and Spain, was a nightmare for other European powers, especially England and the Netherlands. They feared a superpower that could dominate the continent. This set the stage for one of the greatest conflicts of the era. For Charles the Austrian Habsburg, this was his moment. He saw himself as the legitimate heir to the Spanish throne, a direct descendant of the line through his grandmother. He was crowned King Charles III of Spain in Vienna in 1703, a bold declaration of his claim. He gathered his supporters, a motley crew of Spanish nobles who opposed the Bourbon claimant, and with the backing of England, the Netherlands, and other allies, he set sail for Spain. The war that followed was brutal and protracted. It raged across Europe, from the battlefields of Flanders to the plains of Bavaria, and most intensely in Spain itself. Charles spent years on the Iberian Peninsula fighting for his claim. He was a determined, if sometimes stubborn, leader. He marched with his troops, faced sieges, and experienced the harsh realities of war. He even briefly entered Madrid in 1706, and again in 1710, a symbolic triumph, only to be forced out by the staunch support for Philip V, the Bourbon king. The fighting was relentless, a back-and-forth struggle that drained treasuries and lives. Then, in 1711, an unexpected event drastically changed the game. Charles's older brother, Emperor Joseph I, suddenly died without male heirs. This meant that Charles, the claimant to the Spanish throne, was now the sole surviving male. Habsburg. He inherited the vast Habsburg hereditary lands, and even more significantly, the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The man fighting to be King of Spain was now Emperor of a sprawling German realm. This was a massive shift in the European power balance. Suddenly, the very powers who had supported Charles's claim to Spain, England, and the Netherlands grew wary. The idea of one man holding both the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish Empire, a territory that included vast swaths of Italy, the Low Countries, and a colossal colonial empire in the Americas, was just as terrifying, if not more so, than a combined French and Spanish Bourbon superstate. The balance of power, the central concern of European diplomacy, would be utterly shattered. Negotiations for peace began in earnest, culminating in the Treaties of Utrecht in 1713, and Rastatt-Baden in 1714. For Charles, these treaties represented a bitter pill to swallow. After years of fighting, years of personal investment and sacrifice in Spain, he was forced to formally give up his claim to the Spanish throne. The treaties recognized Philip V as the legitimate king of Spain in its overseas possessions. This wasn't an abdication from a throne he currently sat on. Instead, it was an abdication of a deeply held, fiercely fought for claim to a throne that for him was a birthright. It was a shocking moment because it represented the end of a centuries-long dynastic ambition for the Habsburgs to unite the two great branches of their family under one crown. Charles had to accept that the Spanish line of the Habsburgs was truly extinct in the male line, and that the Bourbon dynasty was now firmly established in Madrid. In exchange for this monumental concession, Charles and the Austrian Habsburgs received significant territories in Italy and the Low Countries, essentially the European territories that had previously belonged to the Spanish Habsburgs, but not Spain itself. These included Naples, Sardinia, later Sicily, Milan, and the Spanish Netherlands, which became the Austrian Netherlands. This was a massive expansion of the Austrian Habsburg domains, cementing their power in Central and Southern Europe. But the dream of a united Habsburg realm, stretching from Vienna to Madrid and beyond, was irrevocably shattered. Charles VI, the man who had fought so hard to be King Charles III of Spain, was now simply Emperor Charles VI. He had lost his personal war for the Spanish crown, forced by the jailing realities of a continent desperate for peace. His abdication of the Spanish claim was a pragmatic, albeit painful decision that reshaped the map of Europe. He would go on to rule as emperor for many years, dedicating his life to securing the succession of his daughter Maria Theresa through the pragmatic sanction, a testament to his continued obsession with dynastic security. But the Spanish throne, the one he had bled for, remained forever out of his grasp, a testament to a shocking relinquishment of a claim that had defined a major part of his early life. Number 5. Ferdinand I of Austria. The emperor who stepped aside. The year 1848 burst onto the European stage like a sudden storm, a whirlwind of revolutions that swept across kingdoms and empires. From Paris to Berlin, from Rome to Vienna, people rose up demanding change, freedom, and an end to old ways of governing. At the heart of one of these swirling maelstroms was the Habsburg Empire and its kindly, but profoundly unprepared, Emperor Ferdinand I. Ferdinand I was born in 1793, the eldest son of Emperor Francis I. His early life was marked by a series of significant challenges. He suffered from epilepsy, a condition that was poorly understood at the time and often led to seizures. He also had a speech impediment and a mild intellectual disability. These conditions, combined with a generally delicate constitution, made him a figure of concern for the Habsburg dynasty, which relied on strong, capable rulers to maintain its vast and diverse empire. Despite his challenges, Ferdinand was a gentle soul, known for his good nature and genuine kindness. He loved flowers and gardening and had a simple, almost childlike innocence about him. He was deeply religious and charitable, often giving money to the poor. However, he lacked the sharp intellect, decisive leadership, and political acumen required to navigate the treacherous waters of 19th century European politics, let alone govern a sprawling multinational empire. His father, Emperor Francis I, was a conservative ruler who had skillfully steered the empire. Through the turbulent Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent era of Metternich's system of stability, Francis knew his son's limitation. He famously once told his advisors, "You see that Ferdinand is not fit to rule and that God wants me to go on governing." But when Francis died in 1835, Ferdinand, as the eldest son, dutifully ascended to the thrones of Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and all the other Habsburg domains. His reign was essentially a regency, managed by a council of state, dominated by his powerful uncle, Archduke Louis, and the formidable Chancellor Prince Clemens von Metternich. Metternich, the architect of the conservative order in Europe, effectively ran the empire, maintaining strict censorship, suppressing liberous nationalities within the empire, firmly under control. Ferdinand signed the decrees put before him, attending state functions, and generally playing the role of a beloved, if largely symbolic, monarch. He was affectionately known as Ferdinand the Good, a testament to his pleasant personality rather than his political achievements. His most famous quote, often cited with a touch of irony, was, "I am the emperor, and I wish for strudel." But beneath the surface of Metternich's carefully constructed stability, tensions were building. The Habsburg Empire was a patchwork of different ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Italians, and many others, each with their own languages, cultures, and growing nationalistic aspirations. Liberal ideas about constitutional government, freedom of the press, and civil rights were bubbling up, inspired by the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. The Industrial Revolution was also changing society, creating new urban working classes with their own grievances. In March 1848, the dam finally burst. News of the revolution in Paris ignited similar uprisings across Europe. Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg Empire, erupted. Students, workers, and liberals took to the streets demanding Metternich's resignation, and a constitution barricades went up, and fighting broke out. Metternich, the symbol of the old order, was forced to flee. Ferdinand, despite his limitations, was suddenly thrust into the center of this maelstrom. He was confused, distressed by the violence, and utterly overwhelmed. The court, panicking, struggled to respond. Concessions were made, then withdrawn, then made again. The revolution spread to Hungary, where Lajos Kossuth led a nationalist uprising demanding greater autonomy. In Bohemia, Czech nationalists pressed for their rights. In Italy, revolts broke out in Lombardy, Venetia provinces, under Austrian rule. The empire seemed on the verge of disintegration. The imperial family, including Ferdinand, fled Vienna for Innsbruck, and then later to Olomouc, a safer city in Moravia. The situation was chaotic. The military, led by figures like Prince Alfred I of Windesgratz and Joseph Radetzky, managed to gradually regain control, suppressing the uprisings in Prague, Vienna, and Italy. But the political situation remained volatile. It became increasingly clear to the court and the leading politicians that Ferdinand, with his amiable but fragile disposition, was simply not capable of providing the strong leadership needed to restore order and rebuild the empire. He couldn't grasp the complexities of the political demands or the military strategies. He was a symbol of the old, unyielding regime, and his presence made it difficult to negotiate with the revolutionaries or introduce meaningful reforms. The decision was made, not by Ferdinand himself, but by a powerful group of court advisors, led by his ambitious and more capable nephew, Archduke Franz Joseph, and his mother, Archduchess Sophie. They believed that only a fresh face, unburdened by the promises and failures of 1848, could stabilize the empire. On December 2, 1848, at the Archbishop's Palace in Olomouc, a somber ceremony took place. Ferdinand I, aged 55, formally abdicated his throne. He handed over the reins of power to his 18-year-old nephew Franz Joseph, who was deemed young enough to appeal to a new generation and old enough to assume the immense responsibilities. It was a shocking moment, not because of scandal but because it was a public acknowledgement of the emperor's unsuitability to rule. A decision forced by the very real threat of imperial collapse. Ferdinand reportedly said, "My dear Franz, I have gone through much, but this day is the hardest." His abdication statement, likely drafted by others, spoke of his free will, but everyone knew the circumstances were far from voluntary. Ferdinand spent the rest of his life, another 27 years, living in comfortable retirement at Prague Castle. He was well treated, loved by his family, and continued his hobbies. He famously ordered that his favorite strudel be delivered to him every day. He remained Ferdinand the Good, a gentle figure from a turbulent time, now free from the immense burden of a collapsing empire. His abdication cleared the way for Franz Joseph, who would go on to rule for nearly 68 years, becoming the longest reigning emperor of Austria and a defining figure of the late Habsburg era. Ferdinand stepping aside was a crucial, if quiet, moment that allowed the Habsburg dynasty to survive the storm of 1848, albeit under new, more determined leadership. Number 4. Charles I of Austria, the last emperor's lingering exit. The final act of the long Habsburg drama played out in the grim, exhausted aftermath of World War I. The stage was collapsing, the curtain falling on an era of empires, and the last Habsburg ruler to walk off was Emperor Charles I of Austria. His abdication wasn't a sudden dramatic flourish, but a slow, agonizing process, a lingering departure from a throne that simply ceased to exist beneath him. Born in 1887, Archduke Charles Francis Joseph was not originally destined for the throne. He was the great-nephew of the long-reigning Emperor Franz Joseph, and as a young man he was far down the line of succession. His early life was relatively quiet, spent focusing on his military education and his family. He married Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma in 1911, a deeply devout and strong-willed woman who would become his steadfast partner through the coming storms. Charles was known for his sincere piety, his gentle nature, and his deep affection for his family. He was a stark contrast to many of the old guard of the Habsburg court. He was deeply concerned about social issues and the welfare of his diverse subjects. However, fate had a cruel twist in store for him. In 1914, his great-uncle, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir presumptive, was assassinated in Sarajevo. This tragic event ignited World War I, a conflict that would tear Europe apart. With Franz Ferdinand's death, Charles suddenly became the heir. The quiet Archduke, who had envisioned a life of relatively minor royal duties, was now thrust into the terrifying spotlight. In November 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph, after a reign of nearly 68 years, finally passed away. Charles, at 29 years old, ascended to the dual monarchy's thrones as Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. He inherited an empire already crumbling under the immense strain of the war. Millions of his subjects were dead or wounded. The economy was collapsing. Food was scarce. The diverse nationalities within the empire, long held together by Habsburg tradition, were clamoring for independence. Inspired by President Woodrow Wilson's call for self-determination, Charles immediately recognized the desperate need for peace. Unlike some of his military advisors, he was not a warmonger. He saw the futility and horror of the endless conflict. He launched secret peace initiatives, trying to negotiate a separate peace with the Allied powers. The Sixtus Affair in 1917, where Charles used his brother-in-law, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, as an intermediary to explore peace terms, became a massive scandal when it was exposed. It alienated Germany, Austria-Hungary's main ally, and did not achieve peace with the Allies, who saw it as a sign of weakness. His efforts were noble, but ultimately unsuccessful. The war dragged on, intensifying the internal pressures on the empire. By late 1918, the situation was beyond dire. The military was exhausted and demoralized. The home front was starving. National councils began declaring independence in Prague, Zagreb, and Budapest. The empire was literally dissolving around him. On October 27, 1918, Charles tried a desperate last measure, issuing a People's Manifesto offering to transform Austria into a federation of states, granting greater autonomy to the various nationalities. But it was too little, too late. The tide of nationalism was too strong and the collapse was irreversible. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed, ending World War I. On the very same day, Emperor William II of Germany abdicated. Charles knew his own position was untenable. The various nations of the empire had already declared themselves independent. Vienna was in chaos under the control of revolutionaries. Unlike a formal abdication, which would require him to explicitly give up his titles, Charles issued a carefully worded statement on November 11, 1918. It was a renunciation of participation in state affairs, not an abdication from the throne itself. He stated that he would relinquish every participation in the administration of the state and recognize the decision of the German Austrians to form their own state. This legalistic phrasing was a desperate attempt to preserve the dynastic principle, to leave open a theoretical path for a future return. His wife, Empress Zita, famously declared a ruler can never abdicate. However, for all practical purposes, it was an abdication. The next day, November 12, 1918, the Republic of German Austria was proclaimed. The imperial flag was lowered over the Hofburg Palace, replaced by the Republican colors. The 600-year reign of the Habsburgs in Austria had come to an end. Charles and his family initially remained in Austria at Schönbrunn Palace, under a sort of house arrest. But the new Republican government, fearing a restoration attempt, put increasing pressure on them to leave. In March 1919, Charles and his family were forced into exile, leaving their homeland for Switzerland. Even in exile, Charles clung to the hope of restoration, particularly in Hungary, where the monarchy had a stronger traditional base. He made two ill-fated attempts to reclaim the Hungarian throne in 1921, both of which failed dramatically, ending in armed clashes and further political instability. These attempts cemented the resolve of the new Republican governments in Austria and Hungary to officially depose him and banish the Habsburgs from ever reigning again. After his second failed attempt, Charles and his family were taken by British warship to the Portuguese island of Madeira. The climate there was damp, and Charles, weakened by the stresses of war and exile, contracted pneumonia. On April 1, 1922, at the age of 34, he died a king without a kingdom, a tragic symbol of a fallen empire. Charles I's abdication, or rather his renunciation of participation, was shocking because it wasn't a choice born of personal weakness or weariness, but the forced surrender of an ancient dynasty. In the face of overwhelming historical forces, it marked the definitive end of one of Europe's longest reigning and most influential royal families, leaving behind a power vacuum and a continent forever changed by the collapse of its imperial order. He was canonized by the Catholic Church as Blessed Charles I of Austria. In 2004, recognized for his efforts for peace and his personal piety, a poignant end to the story of the last Habsburg to hold imperial power. Number 3, Francis II, the empire that simply vanished. Imagine being the ruler of an institution that had stood for 1,000 years, a sprawling, complicated entity that stretched across much of Central Europe, steeped in tradition and history. Then imagine being the one who had to sign its death warrant, dissolving it with a stroke of a pen. That was the shocking fate of Francis II, the last Holy Roman Emperor, who in 1806 was forced by the relentless march of Napoleon Bonaparte to dismantle the very empire he inherited. Born in Florence in 1768, Francis was the eldest son of Emperor Leopold II. He grew up in a world on the cusp of seismic change. The Enlightenment was challenging old ideas, and across the border in France, revolution was brewing. Francis was educated in a strict, disciplined manner, preparing him for the immense responsibilities of leadership. He was practical, cautious, and deeply conservative, traits that would both define and ultimately limit his reign. In 1792, his father, Leopold II, died unexpectedly, making Francis, at just 24 years old, the new Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, Bohemia, and Archduke of Austria. He inherited a vast and complex dominion, but also an empire already facing external threats and internal divisions. Almost immediately, he was plunged into conflict with revolutionary France. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte transformed Europe's political landscape. Napoleon was a military genius, a whirlwind of ambition, who shattered old orders and redrew maps with breathtaking speed. For Francis, Napoleon became the defining challenge of his reign, a persistent, overwhelming force that would ultimately lead to the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire itself. Francis was involved in a seemingly endless series of wars against Napoleonic France. These were the Napoleonic Wars, a brutal cycle of campaigns, defeats, temporary alliances, and renewed hostilities. Austria, under Francis's leadership, was a key player in the various coalitions against Napoleon, often suffering devastating losses. Francis himself was forced to flee Vienna multiple times as Napoleon's armies occupied his capital. The Holy Roman Empire, a loose confederation of hundreds of German states, free cities, and ecclesiastical territories, had been in decline for centuries. Its emperor held more prestige than real power, relying on the cooperation of the various princes, many of whom were swayed by their own interests or by Napoleon's promises. Napoleon, with his grand vision of a French-dominated Europe, saw the Holy Roman Empire as an outdated relic, an obstacle to his ambitions. After the decisive Austrian defeat at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, a humiliation that became known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, Napoleon dictated harsh terms. The Treaty of Pressburg forced Austria to cede vast territories and acknowledged Napoleon's dominance over Germany. Napoleon then went a step further, forming the Confederation of the Rhine, a group of German states that formally broke away from the Holy Roman Empire and placed themselves under French protection. This was the final nail in the coffin. On August 6, 1806, Francis II, facing immense pressure and recognizing the reality of the situation, issued a declaration. It stated that he was laying down the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire, releasing all its princes and states from their feudal obligations, and effectively dissolving the ancient institution. This was not a personal decision born of weariness, but a forced abdication, a bitter capitulation to a conqueror. This abdication was truly shocking. The Holy Roman Empire had existed in various forms since the crowning of Charlemagne in 800 AD. It was a symbol of medieval Europe, a supposed continuation of the Roman Empire, and a cornerstone of European identity and political structure for over a millennium. For it to simply vanish at the stroke of a pen was an unthinkable event, a moment that severed a continuous link to a vast and ancient past. However, Francis was a pragmatic man. Even before this monumental abdication, he had taken a shrewd anticipatory step. In 1804, realizing that Napoleon was about to proclaim himself Emperor of the French, Francis preemptively declared himself Emperor of Austria. This clever move ensured that even if the Holy Roman Empire disappeared, his family, the Habsburgs, would retain an imperial title and a powerful, unified state centered on Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. So when he abdicated the Holy Roman Imperial crown in 1806, he did so as Emperor Francis I of Austria, a new, distinct, and more centralized entity. His abdication of the Holy Roman Imperial crown was therefore a calculated, albeit forced, move to consolidate his family's power and ensure their continued imperial status. He gave up an old, largely symbolic title for a new, more concrete one. The years after 1806 continued to be tumultuous. Francis I of Austria remained a central figure in the struggle against Napoleon. He famously married his daughter, Archduchess Marie-Louise, to Napoleon in 1810 in a desperate attempt to secure peace and an alliance, a decision that caused great personal anguish, but was seen as a necessary diplomatic sacrifice. Francis played a key role in the final defeat of Napoleon in 1814 and 1815. He hosted the Congress of Vienna in 1815, where the map of Europe was redrawn and the conservative order was restored. He remained Emperor of Austria until his death in 1835, a symbol of stability and tradition in a rapidly changing world. But the ghost of the Holy Roman Empire, dissolved by his hand, lingered. Its disappearance created a power vacuum in Germany that would eventually be filled by the rising power of Prussia, leading to the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. Decades later, Francis II's abdication of the Holy Roman Imperial crown was just for the Habsburgs, but for all of Europe, as it truly marked the end of an ancient era and ushered in a new age of nation, states, and powerful, centralized empires. Number 2. Philip V of Spain, the king who walked away, then came back. Imagine being a king holding the vast Spanish Empire in your hands, with territories stretching across Europe and the Americas from Naples to Mexico. Now imagine just a few years into your reign you simply decide you're done. You pack up, leave the palace, and hand the keys over to your teenage son. That's what happened with Philip V of Spain, but the truly shocking part, he changed his mind and came back. Born in 1683, Philip was originally Philip, Duke of Anjou, a grandson of the powerful French king. Louis XIV. He was not destined for the Spanish throne until the death of the sickly, childless Charles II of Spain in 1700. Charles II's will shockingly named Philip as his successor. This sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a continent-wide conflict that lasted for over a decade. Despite the bloody war and the efforts of the Austrian Habsburgs to claim the throne, Philip ultimately prevailed largely due to the support of his powerful grandson. He was crowned King Philip V of Spain in 1700. Philip's reign was a period of significant reform and reorganization for Spain. He introduced French-style, centralized administration, modernizing the government, and trying to revive the flagging Spanish economy and military after decades of decline. Under the last Habsburg kings, he was a dedicated, if somewhat reserved, ruler. However, beneath the surface of his successful reign, Philip struggled with profound personal issues. He was prone to bouts of deep melancholy, what we would now recognize as depression. He was highly susceptible to the influence of his wives. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Savoy, was a strong and capable queen who helped him through his early reign. But after her death in 1714, Philip fell into an even deeper depression. It was his second wife, Elizabeth Farnese of Parma, who became the dominant force in his life and politics. She was an ambitious and intelligent woman who effectively ran the court and pursued her own agenda, particularly securing thrones for her sons in Italy. Philip, increasingly withdrawn and reliant on her, often gave in to her wishes. His depression worsened over the years. He became obsessive about his health. Withdrawn from court life and increasingly isolated, he developed a strong religious fervor, becoming preoccupied with his soul's salvation and the perceived sins of his kingly life. He spent hours in prayer, neglected his duties, and sometimes refused to dress or engage with anyone. In early 1724, at the height of one of these severe depressive episodes, Philip made a truly astonishing announcement. He declared his intention to abdicate the throne. His stated reasons were his desire for a more contemplative life, to prepare his soul for death, and to live in quiet devotion to God. He cited his great desire to put into practice all that God has inspired me to do for a spiritual life. He also claimed that the heavy burdens of governing Spain, a responsibility he had never sought, were simply too much for him. On January 14, 1724, Philip V signed the formal instrument of abdication. He renounced the throne in favor of his eldest son, Louis I, who was only 16 years old. Louis had been born of Philip's first marriage. The abdication was met with widespread astonishment across Europe. Kings did not just walk away from thrones, especially ones as vast and powerful as Spain. Philip and Elizabeth then retreated to the royal palace of La Granja de San Ildefonso, a magnificent country residence that Philip himself had commissioned. They intended to live a private, devout life, free from the cares of state. The young Louis I, inexperienced and lacking confidence, took over the reins of government. The experiment was short, lived, and utterly disastrous. Louis I, perhaps overwhelmed by the responsibilities, fell ill with smallpox just 7 months into his reign. On August 31st, 1724, Louis I died. He had reigned for less than a year. This sudden and tragic death threw the Spanish monarchy into crisis. There was no clear successor. Louis had no children. The next in line was Philip's second son, Ferdinand, who was still a child. More importantly, Philip V was still alive, and his abdication had been conditional on Louis I ruling. Philip's wife, Elizabeth Farnese, saw this as an opportunity. She had never truly supported the abdication and now argued passionately for Philip's return to the throne. She believed it was his duty, that no one else could effectively rule, and that it was God's will. Spain's stability hung in the balance. The court, desperate for leadership, implored Philip to return. Despite his earlier desire for a quiet life, Philip was persuaded. His religious advisors, fearing the instability, argued that it was his sacred duty to resume the crown. On September 6, 1724, less than 9 months after he abdicated, Philip V issued a decree annulling his previous abdication and resuming the Spanish throne. His return was unprecedented and utterly shocking. Never before had a European monarch, having voluntarily abdicated, then returned to the throne. It was a testament to the chaotic circumstances following Louis I's death and to the powerful influence of Elizabeth Farnese. Philip V would go on to rule for another 22 years, until his death in 1746. His depression continued to plague him, with periods of extreme withdrawal and erratic behavior, often leaving Elizabeth to manage affairs of state. His reign, despite its dramatic interlude, saw Spain regain some of its lost influence on the European stage, and a continued process of internal reform. Philip V's abdication and subsequent return was a bizarre and captivating episode in royal history. It revealed the immense personal struggles that could afflict even the most powerful rulers, and the unexpected twists of fate that could reshape the course of nations. It remains one of the most unique and shocking royal abdications. A king who's simply tired of the crown, only to be forced to pick it up again. Number 1, Charles V, the emperor who walked away from everything. Imagine being the most powerful man on earth. Your empire stretches across Europe from the Netherlands to Naples, from Spain to vast territories in the Americas. You command armies, dictate treaties, and stand as the secular leader of the Christian world. Then imagine voluntarily giving it all up. All of it. Not because of defeat or revolution or illness, but because you are tired, deeply, utterly exhausted. That's the mind-boggling story of Emperor Charles V, whose 1556 abdication sent shockwaves across the globe and remains one of history's most astounding acts of self-renunciation. Charles V was born in Ghent in 1500, into a world undergoing massive transformation. He inherited an astonishing collection of titles and lands, becoming the heir to multiple powerful dynasties. From his father, Philip I of Castile, son of Emperor Maximilian I, he inherited the Burgundian Netherlands. From his mother, Joanna I of Castile, he inherited the crowns of Castile and Aragon, which included the burgeoning Spanish Empire in the Americas, Sicily, Naples, and Sardinia. And from his paternal grandfather, Maximilian I, He inherited the Habsburg hereditary lands, and most significantly was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. At just 19 years old, Charles found himself the ruler of an empire so vast that it was famously said, "The sun never set on his dominion." It was a dizzying accumulation of power, unprecedented in European history. But with this immense power came equally immense responsibilities and challenges. His reign was a continuous struggle on multiple fronts. First, there was France. King Francis I of France was his lifelong rival, constantly challenging Habsburg dominance in Italy and along the French borders. They fought a series of brutal wars for control of territories like Milan and for influence in Europe. Second, there was the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, a formidable ruler, was expanding his empire into Europe, threatening Vienna itself in 1529 and dominating the Mediterranean. Charles saw himself as a defender of Christian Europe against the Ottoman tide. Third, and perhaps most personally agonizing, was the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church, which began just as Charles became emperor, tore through his German lands. Charles, a devout Catholic, saw it as his sacred duty to suppress heresy and restore religious unity. But the Protestant princes, powerful and determined, resisted, leading to decades of religious conflict and eventually open warfare. Finally, there was the sheer logistical nightmare of governing such a sprawling empire. Communication was slow, rebellion simmered in different territories, resources were constantly stretched. Charles was a diligent and hard-working monarch, constantly traveling across his vast domains to address problems, lead armies, and meet with his subjects. He was fluent in several languages, including French, Dutch, German, and Spanish, but preferred Spanish, which he said he spoke to God. He was a shrewd politician and a capable military commander, but the weight of his responsibilities began to take a toll. He suffered from gout, a painful joint disease which worsened over time, leaving him often incapacitated. His face, marked by the prominent Habsburg jaw, showed the strain of constant warfare and political maneuvering. By the mid-1550s, Charles was weary. The dream of a universal Christian empire, united under his rule, had failed. The Protestant Reformation had splintered Christendom, a wound he could not heal. His wars with France had been inconclusive, draining his treasury and his spirit. The Ottoman threat, though contained, remained a constant menace. He felt he had achieved little of what he had set out to do, and the endless cycle of conflict had exhausted him. Mentally and physically, he made a decision that astonished the world. He decided to abdicate. It was not a sudden impulse, but a carefully planned process that unfolded over more than a year. The first major step came on October 25, 1555 in Brussels, in a grand ceremony held in the Great Hall of the Koudenberg Palace. Surrounded by the Knights of the Golden Fleece, high-ranking nobles and foreign ambassadors, Charles, leaning on the shoulder of the young William of Orange, who would later lead the Dutch revolt, made a moving speech. He spoke of his lifelong service, his constant travels, his efforts to maintain peace and justice, and his physical infirmities. Tears flowed freely as he formally transferred his sovereignty over the Netherlands to his son Philip II. This was just the beginning. The following year, on January 16, 1556, in Brussels, Charles formally abdicated the crowns of Spain and its vast overseas empire, Sicily and Naples, also to his son Philip. He transferred the Holy Roman Imperial title to his younger brother Ferdinand, who had long served as his regent in the German lands and was already king of Bohemia and Hungary. This split the vast Habsburg Empire into two main branches: a Spanish branch under Philip and an Austrian branch under Ferdinand. It was a conscious decision to make the vast empire more manageable, to ensure peace in the family, and to allow both his son and brother to rule effectively. The abdication was shocking, not just because of its scale, but because it was voluntary. No other ruler of such immense power had ever simply chosen to walk away. It signaled a profound shift in European thinking about the nature of kingship and the burdens of power. After completing his abdications, Charles V, the former emperor of a vast world, embarked on his final journey. He traveled to Spain, to a secluded monastery he had chosen for his retirement, the monastery of Yuste in Extremadura. He chose a relatively modest dwelling attached to the monastery. Desiring a life of quiet contemplation and religious devotion, he spent his final 2 years there. He continued to correspond with his son Philip, offering advice on matters of state, though he largely refrained from interfering. He occupied his time with his mechanical clocks, his gardens, and his religious studies. He ate heartily, developed a passion for precise timekeeping, and enjoyed listening to music. He died on September 21st, 1558. At the age of 58, free from the crushing weight of his former responsibilities, Charles V's abdication was a watershed moment in history. It wasn't the end of an empire, but the beginning of a new era. For the Habsburgs split into two formidable but distinct powers. More profoundly, it was a deeply personal act, a testament to the idea that even the most powerful man on earth could decide that enough was enough and choose peace over power, leaving behind a legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire awe.